Welcome back to The World Over. It was a big week in Rome. The Pope issued a stinging letter, a clarification of a liturgical document he issued a few weeks ago, dealing with liturgical translations. It was seen as a direct rebuke of Cardinal Robert Sarah, who heads the Vatican's liturgical office. Here with analysis of this and much more, the Papal Posse, editor-in-chief at thecatholicthing.org, Robert Royal is here in Washington, D.C., and Father Gerald Murray, canon lawyer and priest of the Archdiocese of New York, joins us from Manhattan. Thank you both for being here. I want to begin with this letter. It is a peculiar letter in that it's directed to the Cardinal Sarah, but was made public. It says, Cardinal Sarah, we should do a little background on this. Cardinal Sarah came out in the immediate aftermath of this liturgical norm that the Pope issued, a liturgical law, and he said, calm down. In the section dealing with liturgical translations, all the Pope is saying is the local bishops' conferences will have a greater hand in creating and crafting translations of the Mass. But all the norms of Liturgiam Authenticum, which is John Paul II and Benedict XVI's landmark norms on the liturgy, all of that stands. The Pope said that's not true. Why is this a big deal? Robert Royal.
I think it's less of a big deal in terms of substance than it is in terms of this relationship with Cardinal Sarah. I could be wrong about this. I'm just speaking from the outside. But the Pope has seemed to be very sensitive about what Cardinal Sarah has said in the past. You recall a while ago he was in England and recommended that Mass be said ad orientem, toward the east.
He wanted priests to start turning toward the east.
And the Vatican immediately said, no, we're not going to ask bishops around the world to require that. In this case, I don't speak as a canon lawyer. I'll let Father Murray say that. But when I read through both Magnum Principium, which is what announced the change in the canon law, and I read through this letter, it really struck me as there still has to be some authority to decide whether something is faithful or not. There are all sorts of phrases, by the way, in Magnum Principium, the document, that try to qualify the freedom of these bishops' conferences because obviously you can't just set people loose around the world.
Yeah, but so you sound like Cardinal Sarah. And Father Jerry, I want to get clarification on this. Originally, Cardinal Sarah came out and said, don't worry about it. All the norms, all the approvals and the hands that Rome would normally have in these translations remain. Because Liturgiam Authenticum basically we're asking people to translate being very faithful to the Latin, as close to the Latin as you could be, and in full faith. The Holy Father is saying that is no longer the case. Father Jerry, are we wrong?
Well, what the Holy Father is saying is that the level of Roman involvement in assuring the fidelity of the local translations to the original Latin, the level of Roman authority has been diminished. And that really is what's at the heart of this dispute. The Pope issued this letter in response to a letter that the Cardinal had sent, along with a commentary to the Pope. It was a private letter. The commentary was shared with a few high officials in the Vatican, but it was to the Pope. And in it, Cardinal Sarah basically said the changes involved in giving more authority to local bishops to produce translations does not diminish the fact that his congregation still has to be the authority that determines whether they're faithful to the Latin or not. Now, the Pope wrote back to Cardinal Sarah saying, no, you've misinterpreted what I intended. And the Pope does something a little bit remarkable, which he's announced that certain paragraphs of the original document of John Paul II on translations, that some of those paragraphs have been abrogated, which is canonical language, which means they no longer have the force of law. Now, that's most unusual from a canonical point of view, that a private letter is now a legal instrument to change a previous document. That's going to definitely lead to some questioning, because what happens if Cardinal Sarah's congregation, even in its brief, or let's say not completely thorough, but nonetheless review of a document that comes from a local bishop, says, well, this translation really is poor. Who's going to prevail there? It's troubling because Cardinal Sarah is a wonderful man, and he's only trying to do what his job requires, which is to exercise that authority over the sacred liturgy, which is part of the papal mandate. Remember, the Pope is the one that guarantees the unity of prayer in the Church.
Something else Cardinal Sarah is doing, he was merely interpreting this new legislation in light of the precedent, which was this Liturgiam Authenticum document. Then he pointed out to the Pope, look, yeah, we can conform with your new teaching, but this still remains active. To which the Pope said, no, no, and he struck the previous document. He changed proactively, I guess, the law, or retroactively, the law as it stood under John Paul II. How do you read that? And can he do that in any area of the law?
Well, we're back with the same situation that we've had in many other cases with Pope Francis. That, look, underlying this is his desire to decentralize the papacy. I think that this
and the Church.
Yeah, this is the way we must understand several of the moves that he's tried to make. And there is a legitimate question about some local control and the crafting of the Church in a particular locale, whether at the bishops' conference or the particular bishop should be doing that, of course, is a theological question as well. But what he's trying to, I think, emphasize is that. However, at the end of the day, and as we see even in Magnum Principium, someone is going to have to decide. Suppose that a bishop's conference somewhere does an absolutely atrocious job trying to adapt to a culture that isn't easily reconciled with the mysteries of the Catholic faith. Well, then who's going to say yes or no? It's going to have to be somebody in Rome, because a local bishops' conference or a local group of bishops cannot be just set off on their own.
Okay, before I get to the administrative fallout from this, Father Jerry, final question on this topic. Do you believe that this could lead to individual bishops' conferences engaging in all versions of the liturgy, and that basically liturgical translations are now at the mercy of whoever's voting on it at a given bishops' conference?
That's exactly what I'm afraid of, Raymond. As you know, there's great pressure now through ideology to eliminate the word man from the vocabulary in the English language. Now, Jesus is the Son of Man, and he created man, male and female, he created them. The word man has a meaning in the English language that goes beyond simply the males in the species. So-called inclusive or non-sexist language is a preoccupation for a lot of people who have important roles in the life of the Church. They tried to gender neutralize the Catechism of the Catholic Church translation into English. Fortunately, that failed, but I can see this coming down the pike, and this will cause huge damage. You cannot manipulate language for ideological purposes without doing harm to doctrinal content.
No, I'm old enough to remember Mother Angelica, Father Joe Fessio, and others battling this out almost bishop by bishop, never mind bishop conference by bishop conference, about the inclusive language in the Catechism and in the Mass. And in the Mass translations. We'll see if it's Back to the Future and it's 1990 all over again. I need to ask this question. The nature of this correction, it was issued as a letter, and the Pope tells Cardinal Sarah, this is the third time he's publicly corrected the head of his own liturgy committee. He says, I want you to correct your statements and send copies to all the organizations that publish your commentary. Your thought on this, and then I'm going to play a bite from Cardinal Mueller reflecting on similar actions. Go ahead.
Well, look, the problem here begins that, as I understand it, Cardinal Sarah was not involved in making this difference, this change in the way that we operate in terms of approving or recognizing or confirming. These are all different terms that are
in the document,
the final liturgical translations. And there have been, as we know, battle royals, not only here in the United States, but in Europe. Some of the bishops' conferences in Europe have still not gotten their modern translations approved. So there's an oddity in the way that the Holy Father has operated here. And he's done this also in terms of canon law. He's done it on matters, strictly theological matters, as in Amoris Laetitia, where he doesn't seem to consult with his own staff, so to speak. I mean, Cardinal Sarah was appointed by Pope Francis, not by Pope Benedict or Pope John Paul II. He was appointed by Pope Francis, and presumably he wanted him in this position. And so if you're going to make a change about divine worship, you should probably speak to the prefect of the Congregation of Divine Worship. So it's a strange way of handling a personnel matter, but this is the way this Pope operates.
I'm going to play something, and then I'm going to let Father Jerry react. This is Cardinal Gerhard Mueller, the former head of the Congregation for the Doctrine of Faith. At the time, he was still in that office, and I asked him about the dismissal of 3 priests, faithful, loyal priests, as far as we can tell, good workers in the congregation, who were summarily dismissed in a letter from the Pope. This was his reaction.
Yeah, this is true that I am in favor of a better treatment of our officials in the Holy See, because we cannot only speak about the social doctrine, and we must also respect it. And the Pope himself said, we are some old behaviors of the courts, and I am absolutely against these treatments. And I say we can dismiss only people if they make a mistake. And the criteria for our collaborators in our congregation must be the orthodoxy and the integrity of moral and priestly life, and the competence in the matter, and other criteria must be Italian, or we need people of different languages and cultures. And that was my position I take.
Father Jerry, your reaction to that vis-a-vis this letter to Cardinal Sarah, and how much time do you give him in this office?
Well, I was really surprised when this papal letter was published, because it was a letter that was sent by the Pope to Cardinal Sarah, and he instructed him at the end of the letter to have this letter published on the websites that had published Cardinal Sarah's original commentary.
Right.
And then he also told Cardinal Sarah to send it to the bishops' conferences and then to the members of his congregation. So it's obvious that someone leaked it to the press, because it got to the press before Cardinal Sarah, sent it to these outlets. So there's a lot of, let's say, that kind of infighting in the Roman Curia that Pope Francis was elected to get rid of. And it's unfortunate, in my opinion, that Cardinal Sarah is being marginalized. The Pope, of course, as Bob said, he did not involve Cardinal Sarah in producing this document about new translation norms for Episcopal conferences. When that document was presented, Cardinal Sarah was absent, and now when Cardinal Sarah, as the head of the Congregation for Divine Worship, writes to the Pope in a private matter to explain to him how he intends to interpret the open questions, let's say, raised by the new norms, then suddenly his correspondence becomes a subject of debate in the public. And, I know Cardinal Sarah is somewhat. I've met him on a few occasions. He's a very humble and loyal man. He's a man of solid faith. I agree with Cardinal Muller's statement. People in the Holy See need to treat each other with the respect that we would expect from Christ-like men. And, Cardinal Sarah is a man, I think, who deserves tremendous respect and regard. He suffered a lot when he was bishop in his own country, in Equatorial Guinea, from a communist government. He's a man who is, in fact, only there to serve the life of the Church. And for him to be in this power move, let's say, where he's being leaked on, meaning that people are taking stuff that's private and putting it out in the public forum, this is not a Christian way of treating him.
Okay, very quickly, I've got to get to the Synod. I want you to react to this. In 2019, there is going to be a Pan-Amazon Synod. Now, just to set the table, years ago, Pope Francis wanted to have a synod to consider married clergy, married priests. The Synod Council, which he has in the Vatican, voted that idea down. Now this Pan-Amazon Synod is rolling out, and one of the bishops involved, Bishop Erwin Kraufler, himself a supporter of not only married clergy, but women's ordination, says those two topics could come up and might be a centerpiece of this synod. Your thoughts?
Yeah, look, the Amazon region is a problem. It has a shortage of priests. It has, it's a vast area that needs to be handled in some
Women
fashion.
leadership in a lot of key places.
Sure. And there seems to be some speculation that this is a crack in the door to allow more European concerns actually to be pushed ahead. Now, whether that's going to be the case or not, we don't actually know. But it seems odd that you have a synod about this when it could be handled, it seems to me at least, in a more kind of administrative way. I mean, what are they going to talk about other than there are problems that everyone knows about when you have a relatively larger Catholic population with very few priests who have to handle vast areas. We have some areas in the United States that are actually like that too. Right. But it just, because of the way that that other synods and other events in the past have seemed to morph into something that they were not originally intended to be. I mean, the synods on the family were about the role and the mission of the family in the modern world, and somehow it turned into something about recrafting the family and recognizing irregular families and not calling them irregular any longer. So no one knows at this point what this is going to turn into, but worries about what might be included in a very real problem in the Amazon are not unjustified.
Father Jerry, I want you to react to this as well. There's an upcoming World Meeting of Families in Dublin, Ireland. They've released a booklet in preparation for this event, and I want to show you this page from that booklet. It's the 2018 World Meetings of Families. You see it there. And beneath this picture of two women embracing, it says, while the Church upholds the ideal of marriage as a permanent commitment between a man and a woman, other unions exist which provide mutual support to couples. Pope Francis encourages us never to exclude, but to accompany these couples also with love, care, and support. Some are saying this, too, is opening a door to something that perhaps runs afoul of church teaching. You'd say what?
Yeah, I'd say this is an example of subversion. This is taking something opposed to the gospel. Homosexual activity is gravely immoral. So-called same-sex marriage is a myth. It doesn't exist. It's a creation of the state. It has nothing to do with Christian marriage. I saw that picture of the two Irish women, one of who has the gay flag drawn on her hand. And then to read that statement to say Christian marriage is an ideal. No, marriage is the nature of how God made man and woman. It's not an ideal that's something that we look at, smile at, but say no one can possibly achieve it. Other forms of union, there are lots of people get together to a lot of things. Certainly, when they get together to commit mortal sin, which is what homosexuality involves, we can't say that this is something the Church needs to accompany in the sense of fostering it. It's very troubling because, as Bob said about the synod there for the Amazon, synods become these pressure moments where dissatisfied groups who want to change church teaching get a hold of the mechanism and then start pushing things which are against Christianity. It's really horrifying. Ireland is a Catholic country that's now being eviscerated by this kind of activity where we tell people, oh, homosexual marriage is legal in Ireland. We guess we better face it and just say, okay, this is good. How can the Church make these people feel more comfortable? No, we have to call everyone to conversion. And out of the dream world where so-called same-sex marriage is real marriage, it's not marriage. The best thing those people can do is stop sinning, leave each other and do something that's good with their lives, but certainly not to continue in a relationship which is offensive to God. And remember, who are we serving in this world? Are we serving God or the interests of somebody who comes down the street and says, God's law is too hard, I'm not going to observe it? This is a real crisis that's unfolding in the life of the Church, and I'm very sad to see this, because World Meeting of Families should be about that. Families, not about homosexuality.
Robert Royal, before I go, the Pope has also announced the end of the death penalty. He said capital punishment really has no place in the gospel. You saw that and thought what? He says it's the evolution of doctrine, Bob.
Well, some people write to me and they say that the Pope is a dyed-in-the-wool liberal. He never takes any positions against modern secular liberalism. On this one, though, I think I would be a little qualified, because there are some friends of mine who are involved in, not to get into too many technicalities, but there's a new natural law theory that has been promulgated by some very serious people like Robbie George at Princeton, Germaine Grisey here in the United States. And they are absolutely dead set. These are not liberal Americans. They are dead set against the idea of capital punishment. I myself tend to think that our entire tradition and the practical matter of what do you do with someone who commits a heinous crime and may continue to commit them while incarcerated. I mean, we know that murders, rapes, all sorts of things happen in prison. I think it's an extreme statement to make. The Pope called for the catechism to be changed in this regard, which again seems to contradict the entire previous tradition. Our most recent popes, John Paul II and Benedict, pushed very hard against capital punishment. They wanted to have only a very few instances in modern societies where we have other means to protect society against malefactors. But I think this is, I don't know why it's necessary to go this far. I think you could even say we can't think of any circumstances in the modern world where capital punishment would be permissible, but I can think of an awful lot of circumstances where there's a deterrent factor, a question of justice, a question of retribution, which has not, I don't think, disappeared from our way of thinking about these things socially. It's unusual, and to me, yet another oddity about Pope Francis.
Well, we will leave it there, and I'm sure there'll be much more ahead. Robert Royal, Father Gerald Murray, thank you both for being here. You can catch the latest from both members of the Papal Posse on thecatholicthing.org, which Bob runs.